Ruby and the Wizard by Sheldon King. Chapter 6. Science. Poppy woke first. The shaman was nowhere to be seen, and Fred and the wizard were fast asleep. She was too excited to stay in bed. She could not work out how to untie the ties on the doors, so she lay down and crawled under the flaps of the tent and went to look for children to play with. When Fred awoke a little later, he felt very odd. His head ached and he could not tell where one dream ended and another began, or indeed at what point, if any, reality had stepped into play with all its consequences and logic and what have you. His stomach was somewhat in the same state, but in a more physical, tummy sort of way. Yes, indeed, something was decidedly amiss. The shaman appeared at the front door and handed Fred and the wizard something tea-like. Fred opened his mouth to explain that he was a child and therefore did not drink tea, but the shaman looked into his eyes with such intensity that he found himself raising the earthenware bowl to his lips, and he began to drink. It was as if a loud and beautiful band of musicians had burst into life on his taste buds as chocolate danced with honey and butter smooched with nutmeg. The drink seemed to grab the scattered uneasy strands of his mind and his body and pull them into one. Fred sat up feeling as clear as a bell and ready for adventure. Looking over to the slowly waking wizard with his wide eyes, he whispered, "Magic?"
"Not magic," laughed the wizard. "Science. Our friend the shaman is an extremely clever scientist."
Fred began to giggle. "Seriously?" he mouthed. "He looks like he doesn't even know how television works." Unfortunately, his voice was not as quiet as he thought, for at that moment the shaman returned, already speaking. "If you want to see a man on a horse, for example, they have a big dragon. He eats the man and the horse and chews them up slowly, digesting everything about them and the way they are trotting along the path, their movements, their stories, their histories. When the dragon has digested them, he turns them into a kind of dream which he breathes through his nostrils like smoke. The dream drifts through the universe until it arrives in your country, where a small troll sucks the dream through a pipe and inhales it into his lungs. This makes him queasy. He vomits the story of the man and the horse onto your screen. That is how television works," said the shaman. Fred gave the wizard a bemused glance. But... The wizard silenced him with a look.
"Perhaps you prefer a story in which particles of light are turned into electricity and converted into hundreds of numbers made of ones and zeros that tell all the particles of light where to go and constantly rearranges them on your screen. But ultimately, when you get down to it, all those words, all those names for things, nobody really knows how anything works, or why all those images and words you can watch on your computer are all being dreamt by a huge building whose sole purpose is to remember things. A castle of remembering that has to eat fossils or sunlight or changing air pressure in order to stay awake and not fall asleep and forget everything. Does that make sense?"
"Where is Poppy?" asked Fred. The sky had still been pink when Poppy set off down the rugged little path from their tent into the village. Coming up the hill was a young woman carrying a huge basket on her shoulders, supported by a strap around her forehead. "Hello, I'm Poppy." The woman looked at her as if waking from the saddest dream in the world. She nodded imperceptibly, and her face showed not even a trace of a smile. Poppy skipped off towards a small collection of houses where 3 old women sat around a fire. Poppy knew a chance to get a cookie or a treat or some sort when she saw one. A good way was often to demonstrate her handstands and cartwheels. The ground was cold and rocky, but after a few attempts she had performed a couple of passable handstands. She curtsied and awaited disproportionate applause and compliments. The women said nothing. one making a show of brushing away the dust that Poppy's feet had raised. Poppy had never come across such unfriendly people. She stood up straight and felt frankly a little foolish, skipping away down the hill. A little further down the hill, some children were sitting on rocks watching something across the valley. Thank goodness, she thought. At least now I can play with somebody and they might know where I can get some breakfast. The children did not look up when she skipped up to them. She followed their gaze over the valley, but they did not seem to be looking at anything in particular. What are you looking at? She asked. Nothing, said a girl roughly her age, her eyes briefly drifting in Poppy's direction before sliding off and out of focus. I'm Poppy, she tried. Oh, said the girl noncommittally. Her companions showed no reaction at all. The sky was overcast and Poppy felt a little tired and very depressed. She looked back across the ridge where the mountain fell away behind the children. It was as if the fog surrounding the village was even thicker there. Down through the rocks there appeared to be shapes growing out of the mountainside, perhaps houses or ancient barns and farm buildings. Probably, she thought, she should wait for Fred and the wizard before she went exploring. But Grandfather probably needed another 10 cups of tea if he was even awake. The way down was hard and strewn with boulders. She climbed and jumped and slowly worked her way down. She heard a cry from the children. The girl who had distinguished herself by saying, "Oh," was standing up. "Don't go down there." "Why not?" called Poppy. The girl seemed to lose interest and turned around and sat down. This was not definite enough for Poppy, and she continued down the hill. The mist or fog or whatever it was getting thicker. She could see nothing beyond a few feet of herself all around. The smoke was getting in her eyes, and she felt so sad and lonely she wished that Fred was there. Maybe if she just lay down for a while, the cloud might blow away after all, and then she might feel not quite so sleepy.
This village was once a joyful place, the shaman was saying. It was a non-stop festival, people singing and dancing, children playing, any excuse for laugh and play. This village was famous for it, actually. They called it the Happy Mountain. I visited a few villages in these mountains, and there was always my favorite one. If I was feeling tired or despondent, I would find a reason to visit the Happy Mountain, and I knew my spirits would be revived. Fred and the wizard looked at one another doubtfully. They hadn't been here long, but the Happy Mountain certainly did not feel like an accurate description. It happened gradually, continued the shaman, so you wouldn't notice it at first, and you couldn't say exactly when it had happened. Like boiling a frog, said Fred helpfully. Pardon? Said the shaman. I don't seem to... Never mind, carry on, said Grandfather, giving Fred a look. The people became more and more miserable. Where once they had danced up the steep roads with huge baskets on their heads, now they seemed weighed down by invisible loads, even when they were unburdened. People would avoid your eye. Nobody sang, and the doors to their houses were closed. And this is why you called me, said Grandfather, looking serious and businesslike. Yes, said the shaman. I have tried everything. I have sung mantras and incantations, looked for curses, black magic, and vitamin deficiencies. Everything is as it always was, and yet the people are so gloomy. We need to find Poppy, said Fred impatiently. Of course, said the shaman, calling out to a bunch of villagers crouching by the roadside. They looked up dolefully, and he berated them in a strange tongue. They rose reluctantly to their feet, and the search was mounted.
Time passed, and the sun climbed through the sky. By midday, Fred, Grandfather, and the shaman were becoming quite worried. There was still no sign of Poppy, and the whole village and surroundings had been thoroughly searched. Something black and moving fast in his peripheral vision startled Fred, and for a moment he was unsure whether it was a large bird a little way off, an insect almost in his eye, or an enormous dragon in the distance. He turned his head, and there, dropping down over the rock edge, was a lammergeier, a huge Himalayan vulture riding the air currents down into the valley. Following it with his gaze, he realized that the cliff was actually a rocky slope, precipitous but still traversable. Something about the mist and the dark craggy shapes, not to mention the descending vulture, made him want to look away, and yet he really needed to find his sister. So he forced himself to look again. Was it mist? Maybe it was smoke. No, it was nothing. Time to keep searching. But no, he had to look. Pointing into the mist, he asked the shaman, "What is down there?" "Nothing." "No, there is something. Is there a path? Could Poppy have gone down there?" Chapter 7. Into the Mist.
"Let us look up the mountain again," said the village elder who had been helping them. "But we've already looked up there," said Fred. "Down there is the only place we have not looked." "There is nothing down there," said the shaman again. "Nothing?" said the wizard. "What do you mean, nothing? No mountain? No air? No path? What exactly is absent, and what is in its place?" "Just the old village," said the shaman reluctantly. "Well, that sounds very much like something," said the wizard. "What do you mean by the old village? Is it this village? Has it moved? Is it a different village?" "It is the village that was here before this one," said the shaman. "Nobody knows how long ago it was built. It was deserted when our people arrived many years ago. The situation was good, close to the river and protected by the mountain. So this village was built just a little way away in case of ghosts."
"Ghosts?"
asked the wizard. "Yes, sometimes people have seen shadows and heard sound, songs and laughter, even smoke drifting from the chimneys, so people stay away."
The wizard looked thoughtful. At length he spoke. "Sometimes the place you have to go is the place you do not want to think about, the place you do not see, because you do not want to look. Sometimes you have to gaze long and hard into the darkness and the mist, and you begin to see more clearly, and then you have to step forward boldly." Fred needed no more encouragement, and he began trotting confidently into the murky air. The wizard followed, dragging the shaman bodily behind him. The villagers who had been helping seemed to drift away. The path was less steep than it had seemed, and soon they could make out the shapes of rough dwellings through the fog. Fred had not noticed how hard it was to breathe, whether it was the altitude or the strange mixture of smoke or cloud that seemed to envelop them. Indeed, one dwelling did seem to have smoke issuing from it. The building was like a dome made of rocks, and a thin wisp of smoke was escaping from a small hole in the top. Lying in the dirt by the door was Poppy. Fred ran across the stones and gravel to where Poppy lay and lifted her head. She looked up at him with big, sad eyes and yawned. "I'm tired," she said.
"Let's get her back to the village," said the shaman. "Wait," said Fred. "Why is she here? What is in that hut there? Where is the smoke coming from?"
"He's right," said the wizard.
The door was slightly ajar, and the four companions looked at it apprehensively. The wizard stepped forward and opened it. Fighting the impulse to turn and run, the others followed, and he strode confidently in. The room was very simple. A fire was burning and a large pot hung over it. Some ancient rugs were on the earth floor, and some earthenware jars held feathers and other oddities. It was some time before they noticed the figure crouched in the corner. He appeared to be in a state of meditation or trance. His eyes were closed and he was wearing a number of thick shawls. If the shaman was the oldest person the children had ever seen, this person could have been his great-great-grandfather. His skin was like the soles of a decrepit pair of moccasins, so desiccated as to be almost translucent. A slight quaver in his skeletal fingers the only sign that he was still alive. "Who disturbs the shaman?" His voice, although quiet, was so firm and unexpected that the children nearly jumped out of their skin. "We mean you no harm," began the wizard. "We wondered if you needed any help." "I'm very busy," came the completely incongruous voice. Poppy looked at Fred with her "What the?" face. "What are you doing?" asked the wizard. "I'm holding the people's sorrows," was the answer. The younger shaman, the wizard's friend, turned to the children.
"This is the original shaman from the people who lived in the old village," he whispered. "Those people left, but he is still here."
"What happened?" asked the wizard. There was a silence before the old shaman began again. "The people would come to me with their sickness and their sorrow, and I would take it into myself. I took care of all the tears of the village and held it in a cloud. That way the people were never sad or sick for long. We had the happiest village in all the mountains, but the cloud I was holding got so big and so heavy, I could hardly move. It was so hard to hold." The wizard put his hand on the old man's shoulder as gently as if he was holding a baby bird. "The people are gone," he said kindly. "You can let go now. You can rest." The ancient shaman opened his eyes, and it was as if the children had not noticed that they were closed before, because now they were as startling and as clear as a baby's. Looking into those deep brown eyes, they found themselves among throngs of children and people long gone, endless blue skies and mountains. "Gone?" he asked quietly. "Yes," replied the wizard. "I'm so tired." The old shaman smiled and the tension went out of his shoulders. He let out one long breath. And his body seemed to dissolve into the air, becoming like a wisp of smoke and disappearing up through the chimney. There was a deep silence in the room. Nobody seemed to know what to do next. The wizard inhaled as if to speak, when suddenly there was a thundering, crashing noise outside, and the rain began thrashing the outside of the hut, the crescendo of noise rising in pitch as the rain came in squalls across the mountains. "It hasn't rained in years," said the younger shaman. The wizard pushed against the door, and the rain was rushing in streams down the mountainside, collecting in ponds and lakes and pools between the rocks. Poppy and Fred became aware of another sound in the rain. It was the splashing of hooves over the wet gravel. Ruby was back, pulling a covered palanquin. "Quickly, kids!" called the wizard, and they ran over to the horse and sheltered inside the palanquin. Ruby took off into the air, and in a few beats of her powerful wings, they were back in the village. Back at the shaman's tent, they huddled around the fire and dried their clothes. It rained all night long, all the unshed tears of the old village running down the mountain towards the sea. In the morning, the sky was blue like the sky you see from aeroplanes. The strange silence was replaced with birdsong and the calls of children. The thick cloud laying over the mountain was gone. Poppy and Fred rushed into the light, and within no time at all were making friends. They ate bowl after bowl of magic porridge with the villagers, and copious bowls of yak butter tea, until finally the wizard announced it was time to go. The children shed a few tears of their own as they gathered their clothes and tried to fit all the presents from the villagers into their backpacks. As they waved goodbye and finally climbed aboard the chariot, the shaman hobbled over to them with the last 2 bags. As they waved goodbye and finally climbed aboard the chariot, the shaman hobbled over to them with 2 last bags. They thanked him, and Ruby took off into the air. As soon as they were out of sight of the village, Poppy wanted to know what was inside the bags. They opened them carefully, and inside, wrapped in waxed fabric, was the unmistakable shape and smell of cheese and pickled onion sandwiches. The wizard winked at them. "Sometimes a little magic is the only way," he laughed.